Hello everyone, my name is Eirik. Welcome back into the studio for yet another video. This one is going to be all about working with and casting using acrylic resin. This video is aimed at beginners who want to learn how to use material of acrylic resin, be it aqua resin, hydro resin, jesmonite, etc. They're all the same. We will be casting a little bust out of a full body mold, meaning we'll only use a small part of a larger mold that we've made, which causes some peculiarities when we go to put them all together. Let's get into it. There's a lot that can be said about acrylic resins, and they're used in many applications. That all gets really technical way fast, which means I'm out of my element, way out of my element, when talking about acrylic resins. If you're after using acrylic resin, don't just buy some random stuff from a random website, but buy some from a place that specializes in art supplies so you get the right kind of acrylic resin meant for casting and mold making. Essentially what this material boils down to, what we need to know about it when it comes to working with it, is that it's like working with plaster, yet the final product is a lot harder, it's a little bit lighter, and it absorbs less water, and it's much stronger. Think of it as a super hard, non-absorbent plaster. It's also non-toxic and water-soluble or dissoluble, before it hardens at least, though I would certainly check the technical data sheet to make sure the one you get, the one you are buying, is both non-toxic and water-soluble. Let's get into mixing the material. It's very simple and forgiving, and I'll do it many times throughout this video. First, you pour some of the liquid component into a container, then put the powder component into the same container and mix. You can change the ratio for different thicknesses and effects, and you can add more powder or even more liquid to change the properties of the material. Changing the mix ratio to change the thickness might not be the best idea depending on the type of acrylic resin you're using. The one I have here today, called hydro resin, does this with very few problems usually. It might dry at a slightly different color and the set time changes slightly. It sets up more quickly, but more powder doesn't negatively affect the resin, it seems, at least not the brand that I'm using here. What we're going to be doing with the resin right now is brushing on the first layer or splash coat inside our mold. The purpose of this is to capture all the details in the surface of our mold, of course. If the resin is too thin, it will just run down into the bottom of the mold and we will get an uneven thickness to our splash coat, which we don't want. But if the resin is too thick, it won't be able to capture the details and we'll get a bunch of air bubbles and badly captured details, which we of course don't want. We want to capture all the details we so carefully sculpted into our sculpture. To describe perfectly what kind of thickness you need is difficult, of course, and will require some testing on your part, some trial and error. You could certainly do many very thin splash coats, but this prolongs the process considerably when you take into account the set time for this particular brand of acrylic resin, which is around 45 minutes, and most of them do have a longer working time than plaster. This means a lot of time can be wasted if we're not careful with the mix ratio and what gets done during each application of resin. I try my best, therefore, to make sure that the resin is of a creamy consistency so that I can build up a decent thickness quickly and move on to the next layer without hesitation. The technique for applying the first layer is very straightforward. As you can see, I'm sure. I brush the resin into the silicone surface on the inside of our mold and try my best to brush rather vigorously. This will help break up small air bubbles and get the resin into every detail. Sometimes there are lumps in the resin mixture as well, and while these rarely do anything bad to the surface of your casting, meaning that they don't really show up, brushing with some force will help you break them up and therefore not take any risk of them showing up at least. If the resin thickens up too much during the application, which might happen, I will simply thin it out a bit more with some of the liquid component. As long as the resin isn't too far gone and the liquid component can be integrated into your mixture, It should thin it out and prolong the working time so you can accomplish what you're after. As stated, the next step in the process is going to be a fiberglass reinforcement layer. But before we can apply it, the splash coat should be sufficiently firm so that when we press the fiberglass into the splash coat, it doesn't end up poking through to the front of the casting. While the splash coat sets, we can do something, however, which is cutting the fiberglass to fit inside the casting. Especially if I'm working alone, which I am most of the time. I like to be ready for whenever I'm working with something that sets up and hardens, like resin does. So being prepared for the fiberglass layer means pre-cutting all the fiberglass pieces I'm going to need to fit inside the casting. I will usually cut accurate pieces that are meant to fit into specific places inside the casting. It can be tricky to fold this particular type of fiberglass, so making sure that it's pre-cut to fit is of great help. Notice as we transition here between the fresh application of resin and the one that's dried out, the color of the resin changes from purple-gray to brown. This color change is a dead giveaway that the resin is set up and therefore is ready for the next layer in the application. I don't quite remember the time here. It might be the next day perhaps. It might be after lunch, but in general, you should wait perhaps around an hour at least or so if you are doing a next layer that requires the first layer to be properly firm. That's not always the case, of course, but for the fiberglass layer, it's best if the splash coat is fully set up. Same thing goes for opening the mold. This is best done once the casting is fully set, so there is the least chance of damaging the cast when taking it out of the mold. There are many ways of getting the fiberglass into the mold at this point. I'm going with a way that I've devised that minimizes the mess that I end up making, essentially how much resin gets everywhere on your hands, on your table, while working. The fiberglass needs something to hold it in place. Dry fiberglass laid into a dry mold is just going to fall out. So I mix a new batch of resin, and I'd like this batch to be a bit thinner and more flowy than the previous two that we've mixed and used. We're not looking to apply a thick layer to the surface that needs to stay in place on a vertical surface here like we were with the splash coat. We do, however, want the resin to be a bit sticky so that it holds the fiberglass in place nicely. The mixture is thinner than before, but thick enough to be sticky. It's also important that the resin doesn't struggle to get into any areas of our mold. So a bit thinner helps with that issue as well. The resin is brushed into the mold onto the splash coat, and I try to cover every little nook and cranny very well. Ideally, the splash coat is somewhat smooth to make for an easy fiberglass application. Fiberglass doesn't like to conform to very rough surfaces, so ideally the splash coat will have softened the harsher and sharper edges of the silicone surface, aka the surface of our sculpture on the inside of our mold. But if your splash coat has more sharp edges, because you've applied it very roughly, you should essentially, take more care when applying it. I brush resin into a decent chunk of the mold, and then I lay fiberglass down into the mold and press it firmly down so that there is no air pockets between the surface and the fiberglass. Every piece of fiberglass should be overlapped by the next piece of fiberglass to create an interwoven surface with no fiberglass piece sitting there on its own. A fiberglass piece which is not overlapped is just a small island of strength which can then have cracks form around the edges of it. Overlapping every piece keeps the entire casting super strong. I don't overlap too much, however, since this would of course add weight and add to the amount of fiberglass I would have to use, therefore adding to my material cost without substantially improving the end result. The fiberglass should be applied up close to the edges of the mold, but no piece of fiberglass should be proud of the edge of the mold. I'll usually stay a few millimeters away from the edge at least to make sure that there is nothing standing proud of the edge of the mold. Having worked really carefully up until now and made sure that the edges are clean and clear for all to see really makes a massive difference. With a very thin mixture of resin, which is going to be able to get everywhere, we're going to seal the entire inside surface of the casting and make sure none of the fiberglass can come loose and that they're all attached to each other. The thin resin mix is to ensure the resin can flow under and fill voids or gaps between the fiberglass layer and the splash coat layer. You'll notice when you do this that the casting itself will change its sound when you tap on it. When it's only fiberglass applied, it will sort of have a hollow sound to it, like it's not a solid piece, probably because it isn't. And once this thin layer of resin is brushed everywhere, the entire surface is sealed and the casting will, when tapped lightly, have a more solid sound to it, like it's one solid piece at that point. And this is what we're after. A solid and strong piece with no voids or hollows between any of the layers, and a piece where all the fiberglass is properly stuck and can never come loose, both from the surface and from each other. This step does add a touch of weight, but since the resin is thin, we're not building up a lot of thickness here really, so we're not adding too much weight.